My name is Ava. I'm 17, and up until 3 months ago, I believed that dreams could be bought with money. I lived in a small house in rural West Virginia, where the peeling walls held more hopes than furniture, and where my mom left before sunrise to clean other people's homes while my dad sank under bills that grew faster than the weeds in our backyard. My world consisted of borrowed books from the library, taking care of my little sister, Lily, who was 10, and the impossible dream of one day wearing a white coat and saving lives as a doctor. It was on a hot afternoon in March that everything changed. I was helping Lily with her homework when I heard unfamiliar voices in the living room. Through the crack in the door, I saw a tall man in a flawless suit speaking to my parents in a slow, accented English. His words danced in the air like golden promises. Educational exchange, unique opportunity, a bright future for your daughter. My heart pounded. Hadestevi finally knocked on our door. The man introduced himself as Rashid Omansori, a representative of a Middle Eastern educational foundation. He explained that they were looking for talented young people from humble families to offer full scholarships to international schools. He showed us pictures of dazzling university campuses with modern labs and libraries that looked like cathedrals of knowledge. Your daughter, he said, looking directly at me through the crack in the door, has exactly the profile we are looking for. My parents exchanged looks filled with a tension I couldn't decipher. Mom squeezed Dad's hand tightly, and I saw her tears before she even shed them. How long would she be away? She asked with a choked-up voice. 2 years initially, Rashid replied, but with the possibility of an extension for college. And, naturally, there is a financial compensation for the family, as a form of support during the young lady's absence. The number he mentioned made the air in the house grow dense. $500,000. Lily tugged on my shirt sleeve, whispering, Ava, you're not leaving, are you? I hugged her, feeling the weight of a decision that seemed to have been made before I even fully understood what it was about. That night, while my parents talked in whispers in the kitchen, I lay awake, imagining what it would be like to step into a real lab, to have teachers who didn't have to give lessons holding a broken piece of chalk. The next few days passed in a hurricane of papers, signatures, and preparations. Rashid returned twice, always with more documents, always with more promises. He spoke about the rich culture of the country that would host me, about the opportunities for personal growth, about how I would be an ambassador for America in distant lands. My mom packed my few clothes with excessive care, as if each fold were a prayer. My dad avoided looking me in the eye, limiting himself to comments about how I should take advantage of the opportunity. On the eve of the trip, Lily refused to leave my room. Promise you'll come back soon? She pleaded, grabbing my hand with the strength of someone who senses a farewell that will last too long. I promise, I replied, not knowing what a cruel lie I was telling. That last night at home, lying next to her, I heard my parents arguing quietly.
Just to make sure you keep getting our stories, subscribe to the channel, give this one a like too, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from.
The words came in fragments. We had no choice. It's for her future. She'll understand when she's older. I tried to decipher the tone of sadness that didn't match the happiness I expected to feel. The airport was a blur of tears and hurried hugs. Mom handed me a rosary that had belonged to my grandma, and my dad, for the first time in years, told me he loved me. Rashid showed up right on time, with silent assistants who handled my luggage as if I were a precious commodity. The plane was bigger than anything I had ever seen, and during the 16-hour flight, I alternated between restless sleep and the anxiety of someone approaching a dream. A flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed my silence and asked if I was okay. First time flying? She asked. I told her about the exchange program, about my dreams of becoming a doctor, about how my family had made sacrifices to give me this opportunity. She looked at me with a strange, almost melancholic expression before saying, I hope your dreams come true, honey. I really do. There was something in her voice that gave me a chill, but I chalked it up to the nervousness of someone about to start a new life. When the plane landed at the international airport in Doha, the desert heat hit me like a physical wave. Rashid was waiting for me with 2 men in traditional clothing, who greeted me politely but without smiling. During the car ride, which lasted nearly 2 hours, I tried to talk about the school, when classes would start, about other American students. The answers were evasive, always redirecting to comments about the landscape, about how I should rest, about how I would have plenty of time to adapt. The architecture gradually changed from urban modernity to something more traditional, more isolated. The buildings became more spread out until, finally, I saw our destination. An imposing mansion built like a mirage in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by high walls and ornate gates. "Where is the school?" I asked, feeling the first real pang of worry. "You will be studying here, on the property," one of the men replied. "It is a very special, very exclusive educational system." As we crossed the Golden Gates, I noticed they closed behind us with a definitive sound, like the echo of a door slamming shut at the end of a long hallway. My new reality stretched out before me in perfectly manicured gardens, marble fountains, and architecture that seemed to have come out of the stories Lily liked me to tell. But there were no signs of other students, no desks, no library. There was only a growing feeling that something was terribly wrong and that my parents had known it when they hugged me for the last time. The main door of the mansion opened, revealing an interior more luxurious than anything I could have imagined. Persian rugs covered marble floors, crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and the air conditioning kept a perfect temperature that contrasted with the suffocating heat outside. Women dressed in traditional clothing greeted me with silent bows, guiding me through corridors adorned with golden Arabic calligraphy and paintings that seemed to tell stories of ancient times. I was led to a room that was bigger than the entire house I had grown up in. The bed had a silk canopy. There was a balcony with a view of endless gardens, and a bathroom with a marble tub that could easily fit 3 people. On the bed, I found traditional women's clothing carefully laid out, accompanied by a note in English: "Dress appropriately for dinner at 8 o'clock. You will be introduced to Sheikh Youssef al-Rashid, your host." For the first time since I had left home, I allowed myself to cry, not out of sadness, but out of overwhelming confusion. This was not a school. There were no other students, and I was beginning to understand that the word exchange had been used very loosely. I put on the clothes left for Mia, long dress of fine fabric, with delicate embroidery in, tried to calm myself by looking out the window. The desert sunset painted the sky in colors I had never seen, orange blending with pink and purple, creating a spectacle that would have been romantic if I wasn't starting to feel scared. At 8 o'clock sharp, one of the women who gestured for me to call her, Layla, led me to an ornate dining hall. The table was long enough to seat 20 people, but only 2 places were set. I waited standing, as Layla indicated with gestures, until I heard footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. My heart raced as I prepared to meet the man who would control my destiny for the next 2 years. Sheikh Youssef al-Rashid entered the hall with the presence of someone accustomed to commanding, but his expression was one of genuine surprise upon seeing me. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his 30s, with dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of ancient responsibilities. He wore impeccable traditional clothes, but there was something in his posture that suggested discomfort, as if he also didn't know exactly what to do with me. He gave a formal bow and invited me to sit, speaking in hesitant but correct English. "You must be tired from the journey," he said, serving mint tea in delicate cups. "I hope your accommodations are suitable." I thanked him politely, but I couldn't hold back the question that was burning inside me. "When do classes start? When will I meet the other American students?" His expression changed subtly, a shadow of confusion crossing his face. "Other students?" he repeated slowly. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. You are not here to study with other students?" The bitter tea went down my throat along with the first real wave of panic. "Then why am I here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, looking at his own hands before answering. "My understanding was that your family had agreed to an arrangement, a family commitment." The word commitment echoed in the hall like a funeral bell. And it was in that moment that I understood that my parents had not sent me away to study. They had sold me. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the ticking of an ornate wall clock. Sheikh Youssef seemed to notice my agitation and leaned forward, his voice gentler. "You really didn't know, did you?" I shook my head, unable to form words. He sighed deeply, like someone who had just understood the magnitude of a problem much larger than he had imagined. "We need to talk," he said. "But first, you need to know that you will not be forced to do anything until we fully understand this situation." That first night, lying in the luxurious bed that felt more like a golden prison, I understood that my life had changed in ways I couldn't yet fully process. Outside the window, The desert stretched infinitely under a starry sky that seemed to mock my smallness. Thousands of miles separated me from home, from Lily, from everything I knew. And for the first time in my life, I began to question if dreams were really worth any price, Shelley, when you find out you weren't the one who chose to pay it. The loneliness of the first week was almost unbearable. I wandered through the mansion like a ghost, exploring empty rooms, libraries in Arabic that I couldn't read, and gardens where only the wind kept me company. Layla, the woman who had greeted me, was my only source of limited communication. She spoke a few words in English and communicated mainly through gestures and facial expressions that I gradually learned to interpret. She was the one who brought my meals, who took care of my clothes, and who, I gradually realized, was the only person in that house who looked at me with something resembling compassion. I tried to use the room's phone several times, but I discovered it only made internal calls. When I asked to use a phone that could call the US, I was politely directed to speak with the Sheikh first. My attempts to leave the property were equally frustrated by locked gates and guards who smiled politely while gesturing for me to go back inside. It wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. No one yelled at me. No one threatened me, but the barriers were clear and insurmountable. During those days of silent exploration, I learned about the house's routine. Sheikh Yusuf left early in the morning and returned late in the afternoon, always with a serious expression and papers in his hands. Other people came and went, men in suits who spoke in quick Arabic, older women who seemed to be distant relatives, and occasionally a figure I recognized as Rashid, the man who had brought me from the US. Whenever he appeared, the conversations became more intense, the voices lower. It was on a particularly hot afternoon, when the air conditioning had broken, and I was trying to find relief in the garden, that Layla approached me with a different expression. She sat down next to me by the marble fountain, looked around to make sure we were alone, and then did something unexpected. She spoke in clear English, although with a heavy accent. "You have daughter?" she asked. I shook my head, confused. "Little sister," I replied. She nodded sadly. "I had daughter. 16 years. Came here 5 years ago." My blood ran cold. "Where is she now?" I asked, though a part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Layla looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in golden hues. "Died in second year. Could not ... adapt." The words came out of her like heavy stones, carrying years of pent-up pain. "That is why I stay here, to care for girls who arrive, to be a mother when they need." At that moment, I understood that I wasn't the first, nor would I be the last. "How many have come?" I asked, though my voice came out as a whisper. "Many," she replied. "Some adapt, marry, stay. Others ... do not." I didn't need to ask what happened to those who didn't adapt. The sadness in Layla's eyes told the whole story. "But you," she continued, taking my hand, "you are different." Sheikh Yusuf sees it too. He is confused, questioning things he never questioned before. This conversation changed everything. I finally had someone who understood my situation, someone who could help me navigate this strange world I had been dropped into. Layla became my informal teacher, teaching me about the local culture, about the expectations, about how to survive without completely losing my identity. But more importantly, she became my ally, the only person in that house who saw in me a lost daughter instead of an acquisition. The conversations with Sheikh Yusuf began to happen more frequently after the first week. He seemed genuinely troubled by the situation, asking questions about my family, about what exactly I had been told before I came. I told him about my dreams of being a doctor, about the books I borrowed from the library, about how I took care of Lily while my parents worked. He listened with growing attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed his surprise at my education and my interests. "You really believed you were coming here to study," he said in one of those conversations, more as a statement than a question. "My parents said it was an exchange program," I replied. "That I would have the opportunity to become a doctor? That you chose our family because you saw potential in me." He shook his head slowly. "What I was informed was very different. I was told that your family was going through extreme financial difficulties and that you had agreed to a marital commitment in exchange for financial support." The word marital hit me like a punch to the stomach. "Marriage," I managed to say. He nodded gravely. "That was my understanding. Yes, but now I realize there have been irregularities in the process." "You were clearly not aware of the actual terms." We were silent for a long moment. both processing the enormity of the lie that had brought our lives to this point of intersection. "What happens now?" I asked, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. Sheikh Youssef stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the garden. "Now," he said, "I need to find out exactly how this happened and what can be done to correct it." There was something in his tone that gave me hope for the first time since my arrival. "You are not a prisoner here," he continued. "Not until I fully understand this situation." That night, for the first time in a week, I was able to sleep soundly. Not because my problems had been solved, but because I finally had the feeling that someone in a position of power was on my side. Layla had told me that Sheikh Youssef was known for his integrity, that he was different from many other men in similar positions. "He lost his wife 3 years ago," she whispered while brushing my hair before bed. "Since then, he has been questioning many traditions. Perhaps Allah brought you here to awaken his conscience even more." The following days brought subtle but noticeable changes in the atmosphere of the house. Sheikh Youssef cancelled several meetings to spend more time talking to me, wanting to understand not just my situation, but who I was as a person. He discovered my passion for learning, my constant worry about Lily, my determination to do something meaningful with my life. In return, he began to tell me about his own struggle with cultural expectations, about how the death of his wife had made him question many traditions that he had previously accepted without thinking. Rashid appeared again in the second week, bringing with him other men and a very different energy than before. The voices coming from Sheikh Youssef's office were louder, more tense. Although I didn't understand the Arabic words, the tone was clearly one of confrontation. Layla found me hiding near the door, trying to understand what was happening, and gently led me away. "The Sheikh is fighting for you," she whispered. "He is questioning the agreement, demanding details he was not given before." Later that day, Sheikh Youssef sought me out with a somber expression. "I need you to tell me exactly how it all happened," he said. "Every detail, every conversation, every promise that was made." I spent the next 2 hours recounting everything: Rashid's arrival, the promises of education, the money mentioned, my parents' reactions, the haste with which everything was arranged. He took notes, occasionally interrupting to ask for clarification. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "Did your family really believe it was an educational program?" he asked finally. "My mom did, for sure," I replied. "My dad, now, I'm not so sure." He avoided looking at me in the last few days. Sheikh Youssef nodded slowly. "What I was told was that your family was financially desperate and consciously agreed to send you as payment for a debt, essentially." The word debt echoed in the room, carrying the weight of the betrayal I was still trying to fully process. "They sold me," I said, "more to myself than to him?" "Apparently, yes," he replied softly. "But even if they did it consciously, which is not clear, you are underage and cannot be considered part of a commercial agreement. There are laws, even here." It was at that moment that I began to see Sheikh Youssef not as my captor, but as someone who had also been deceived, manipulated by the same men who had lied to my family. He had paid a considerable sum believing in a version of events that simply did not correspond to reality. "Are you going to send me back?" I asked, surprised to feel a pang of anxiety at the possibility. It wasn't that I wanted to stay, but going back would mean confronting my parents' betrayal. It would mean accepting that my family had made an irreversible decision about my future without my participation. "I don't know yet," he replied honestly. "First, I need to find out the extent of the lies that were told to us. Then, we need to decide together what the best path is." The word "together" surprised me. In 2 weeks, he had gone from a threatening figure to someone who consulted me on decisions that would affect my own future. It was such a strange concept to have an active voice in my own life that it took me a moment to fully process it. That afternoon, as I walked through the gardens with Layla, she told me more about Sheikh Youssef. "He was very traditional before his wife died," she explained. "He accepted the elders' arrangements, followed customs without question. But Amara, his wife, was educated, had strong opinions. She taught him to see women differently. When she died of cancer, he blamed himself for not having noticed the symptoms sooner, for not having given her access to the best doctors from the beginning. This information made something click in my mind. Did she want to be a doctor too?" I asked. Layla shook her head. "No, but she believed that women should have access to education, to medicine, to choice. She said that if she had had a female doctor, maybe she would have felt more comfortable talking about her symptoms sooner." Suddenly, I understood why my dreams of medicine had touched something in Sheikh Youssef, why he seemed so interested in my academic ambitions. The third week brought a storm to the desert, literally and metaphorically. The strong winds kept everyone inside, while sand beat against the windows like golden rain. It was during this storm that I received the most devastating news since my arrival. Sheikh Youssef came into my room with a somber expression, carrying a phone in his hands. I managed to make contact with the US, he said. There is something you need to know. My heart raced. Is it Lily? Did something happen to her? He shook his head. Your sister is fine, but she found some documents that your father tried to hide. Documents that confirm that your family was aware of the real nature of the agreement. The words fell on me like heavy stones. They knew, I murmured. They knew it wasn't for studying. Sheikh Youssef sat in the armchair near my bed, maintaining a respectful distance. According to your sister, who got help from a teacher to translate the papers, the agreement clearly specified that you would be presented as a potential wife in exchange for payment of the family's debt. Each word was a stab. Lily also found a letter that your mom had written but didn't send, asking for forgiveness and explaining that they saw no other way out. Tears began to stream down my face before I even realized I was crying. It wasn't just Sednasit was Inga, it was a sense of betrayal. It was the complete collapse of the image I had of my family. They sent me knowing I would be forced to marry, I said, each word coming out as a sob. They let me believe lies until the very last second. There's more, Sheikh Youssef said softly. Your sister has contacted the authorities. There is an investigation underway. Your parents have been arrested. The news should have given me satisfaction, a sense of justice being done, but all I felt was an immense emptiness. My family, the only anchor I had in the world, had completely disintegrated. And Lily? Where is she now? With your aunt, he replied. She is well cared for and very much wants to talk to you. But first, you need to know that you now have real choices. The American authorities are aware of your situation. The embassy has been notified, and no one can force you to do anything against your will. For the first time since I arrived, I really had options. I could go back to the US, face the ruins of my family, and try to rebuild a life from scratch. Or what? I asked, realizing I had said the thought out loud. Sheikh Youssef hesitated before answering. Or you stay here for as long as you wish, as my protected, not as my property. You would have access to education, to university preparation, to the resources necessary to pursue your dreams of medicine. The proposal was surreal. Why would you do that? I asked. Why would you help me after everything? He stood up, walking to the window where the sandstorm was still dancing. Because Zamara would have done the same thing for you, he said simply, and because I have found that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking traditions that we have not questioned for long enough. We were silent for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts about how lives can change completely in a matter of weeks. That night, for the first time in a week, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I was still thousands of miles from home, still dealing with my family's betrayal, still in a country whose culture I was only just beginning to understand. But I had choices, and as scary as that was, I also had someone willing to support me while I figured out which of those choices was the right one for me. The decision to stay didn't come all at once. It was a gradual construction, made of long conversations with Sheikh Youssef about philosophy and medicine, of afternoons learning Arabic with Layla, of nights looking at the starry desert sky and trying to imagine my future. He arranged for me to have access to computers, the internet, and books in English and other languages. For the first time in my life, I had an infinite library within my reach. More importantly, he arranged for regular calls with Lily. Seeing her on the computer, even through a screen, was like getting oxygen after weeks of not being able to breathe properly. She had grown so much in the few weeks since I left, not physically, but emotionally. The discovery of our parents' betrayal had forced her to mature quickly, but it had also awakened in her a determination that I recognize as being very similar to mine. I don't hate them, she told me during one of these calls, but I can't understand how they could lie so much. Mom cried for days after the police took them. I couldn't completely hate them either, although the anger was still a constant presence. They were desperate, I replied, trying to find some explanation that made sense. Desperate people do terrible things sometimes. Lily shook her head with a wisdom that shouldn't exist in a 10-year-old child. Antro said they could have asked for help in other ways, that there are always other options besides selling your own daughter. The brutal simplicity of her statement hit me like a slap. Even a child could see that there were alternatives our parents refused to consider. During these weeks of video calls with Lily and daily conversations with Sheikh, I began to understand that he was also going through a transformation. The revelations about how I had been brought here forced him to question not just this specific case, but the entire system that allowed such deceptions to happen. He began to investigate other similar arrangements, discovering a network of intermediaries who took advantage of families' poverty to feed the demands of rich men who wanted young wives. The magnitude of the discovery left me stunned. Sheikh Yusuf had hired private investigators who tracked Rashid's activities for the last 5 years. The reports revealed a systematic pattern. Indebted families were identified through illegal databases, studied for months, and then approached with proposals carefully crafted to seem legitimate. The lies were adapted for each situation, sometimes educational programs, sometimes job opportunities, sometimes even temporary adoptions by rich families. Each document Sheikh Yusuf showed me was a piece of a horrifying puzzle. Photographs of smiling girls at airports, falsified contracts with logos of non-existent educational institutions, testimonies from families who had been convinced to hand over their daughters for golden promises. Some of these girls had been lucky they found men who, like Sheikh Yusuf, discovered the lies and did the right thing. Others were not so lucky. "I am compiling evidence for the international authorities," he explained to me one afternoon, surrounded by piles of papers in his office. "But I need your help to understand how they operate." You lived the process from beginning to end. You saw their tactics working. Agreeing to help meant reliving every painful moment, from the first conversation with Rashid to my arrival here. But it also meant transforming my experience into a weapon against those who did this to other girls. It was during these documentation sessions that I discovered even more disturbing details about my own situation. Rashid had investigated my family for almost 6 months before making his first approach. They knew about my dad's debts, about my grandma's health problems that had drained our savings, about my passion for learning and my dream of being a doctor. Every word of his proposal had been calculated to touch exactly on our most vulnerable points. "They knew I dreamed of studying medicine," I muttered, looking at a dossier that contained detailed information about my family. "They knew my parents would feel guilty for not being able to give me that opportunity." Sheikh Yusuf nodded gravely. "That's why this scheme works so well. They don't just exploit poverty, they exploit the love that parents feel for their children. They turn that love into a weapon against them." The understanding that my parents had been manipulated almost as much as I had brought a complex mix of relief and anger. On one hand, I finally understood that they hadn't coldly sold me for money. On the other, it still hurt deeply that they had made such a drastic decision about my future without consulting me, without even considering other alternatives. These discoveries coincided with even deeper changes in my relationship with Sheikh Yusuf. The long hours working together, analyzing documents, and building evidence brought us closer in a way neither of us had anticipated. He was no longer the mysterious and potentially dangerous man I had met that first night. He was someone intelligent, compassionate, fighting against a system that he himself had inadvertently sustained for years. One night, after a particularly intense session analyzing the testimonies of other victims, he found me crying in the garden. "It's hard to read about other girls who went through what you went through," he said, sitting next to me on the marble fountain that had become our favorite place to talk. "Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier to just pretend none of this is happening." "But you can't do that," I replied, wiping away my tears. "I can't do that. Now that we know, we have a responsibility to act." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, admiration, mixed with something deeper. "You are 17 and have more moral courage than men 3 times your age," he said softly. "Amara would have adored you." It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife in such an intimate way, and I realized that I had become part of his healing journey as much as he had become part of my survival journey. "Tell me about her," I asked. He smiled, a melancholic but genuine smile. "She questioned everything, just like you. She never accepted because it's always been that way as an answer to anything." As he spoke about Amar, about how she had changed his perspective on traditions and on the role of women in society, I understood that my presence here was serving a purpose that went beyond justice for other victims. It was helping Sheikh Youssef honor his wife's memory in a more meaningful way than simply mourning her death. The weeks turned into months, and our investigation began to yield concrete results. Through international human rights organizations, we managed to track down 5 other girls who had been brought in through similar schemes. 2 of them were in abusive situations and needed to be rescued. One had managed to escape on her own and was living illegally in a neighboring country. The other 2, like me, had found men who recognized the deception and were trying to do the right thing. The process of building an international legal case was complex and time-consuming, but every small victory gave us more motivation to continue. When we managed to have Rashid formally charged with human trafficking, when we saw his photograph in the newspapers as a wanted criminal, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal revenge. It was the feeling of having transformed my pain into something useful.
Since you've been here with me all this time, it means you enjoy our story. So, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Give this one a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from.
During this period, my relationship with Sheikh Youssef continued to evolve in ways neither of us could have fully predicted. It wasn't romantic, I was still a minor, and we both absolutely respected that. But there was an emotional and intellectual connection that deepened every day. He became my mentor, my protector, my partner in our crusade for justice, and gradually, something I could only describe as family. "Will you stay?" he asked one night after we received the news that our evidence had been accepted by the International Tribunal. "Even after all this is over, when you have completely free choices, will you choose to stay?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I didn't know how to articulate the complexity of my feelings. "I don't know," I answered honestly. 6 months ago, I couldn't imagine a life outside my small town in the US. Now, I can't imagine the life without. I hesitated, searching for the right words, without this sense of purpose, without the possibility of making a difference in other people's lives. He nodded understandingly, and that can be done from many places, in many ways. It was around this time that Lily made her first visit. Seeing my little sister get off the plane, taller and more mature, but still with the same smile that lit up my childhood days, was like watching my heart mend after months of being fragmented. Sheikh Youssef had arranged for her to stay for 3 weeks, long enough for her to get to know my new life and for me to assess whether it was possible to unite the pieces of my family in a new configuration. "It's very different from what I imagined," Lily told me on the first night as we explored the mansion together. "I thought you would be sad, a prisoner. But you seem, I don't know, stronger." She was right. The months of struggle, of discovering my own strength, of learning that I had a voice and the power of choice, had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. During Lily's visit, she had the opportunity to get to know all aspects of my new life. She spent afternoons with Layla, learning to cook Middle Eastern dishes and listening to stories about different cultures. She accompanied some of our work sessions with the investigation, impressed by the seriousness of our effort to help other girls. And, most importantly, she had long conversations with Sheikh Youssef about education, about opportunities, about how people from different worlds could build mutual understanding. "He really cares about you," she told me one afternoon, after spending 2 hours discussing math with him in the garden. "Not like someone who owns something, but like a dad or an older brother." Her observation made me realize something I had been avoiding recognizing. Sheikh Youssef had become family to me in a way that transcended the bizarre circumstances that had brought us together. On the last day of Lily's visit, we organized a special ceremony in the garden. It wasn't a wedding or any kind of romantic commitment. It was something we created ourselves, a celebration of free choices, of family built with intention rather than just circumstance. Layla had prepared a mix of American and Middle Eastern foods, and we invited some of the other women from the house, as well as some of the allies Sheikh Youssef had made during our campaign for justice. "Today we celebrate not where we started, but where we choose to be," Sheikh Youssef said, raising his glass in a toast. "We celebrate Ava, who transformed a terrible experience into strength to help others. We celebrate Lily, who showed that courage has no age. And we celebrate the idea that families can be built with love and choice, not just with blood and tradition." As everyone toasted, I looked around at the people who had become my chosen family. Layla, who had lost a daughter but gained 2 granddaughters in Lily and me. Sheikh Youssef, who had discovered that honoring traditions did not mean accepting injustice. Lily, who had shown that integrity and courage could flourish even in the most difficult situations. And me, who had learned that sometimes the most unlikely paths lead us exactly where we need to be. After Lily returned to the U.S., with the promise of coming back for school breaks and eventually coming to study here, when she was older, I had time to reflect on all the transformations of the last few months. I had arrived here as a victim, a commodity, a girl sold by her own family. I was becoming a young woman with a voice, with purpose, with the ability to choose her own destiny. "What do you want to do now?" Sheikh Youssef asked me one night, after we received the news that our evidence had led to the arrest of 3 more members of Rashid's network. "With all this experience, with everything you've learned, what's the next step?" The question made me realize that, for the first time in my life, I really had control over my answer. "I want to study medicine," I replied without hesitation. "But I also want to continue working to help other girls. I want this terrible experience to become the foundation for something good, something that makes a difference in the world." He smiled, that smile that had become so familiar and comforting. "Then we will figure out how to make both things happen." The following months were dedicated to planning and preparation. Sheikh Youssef arranged for me to have intensive private classes to prepare for university entrance exams, both in medicine and human rights. We also established a small foundation, discreetly funded by him, dedicated to identifying and helping victims of human trafficking disguised as educational opportunities. During this period, our relationship continued to evolve, but always within the appropriate limits for our ages and circumstances. He became my mentor, my protector, my partner in our shared mission, and gradually, as I approached adulthood and gained more independence and confidence, something that we both recognized as being the beginning of something deeper, but which we knew could only be explored when I was older and had had the chance to discover who I really was outside of the circumstances that had brought us together. "There's no rush," he told me in a conversation about the future. "You have a whole life ahead of you to discover what you want, who you want to be, how you want to live, and no matter where those discoveries take you, you will always have a home here, a family here, support here." It was this freedom, the complete absence of pressure or expectations, that paradoxically made me want to stay, to want to build something here. When my 18th birthday finally arrived, we organized a celebration that marked not just my coming of age, but my complete transformation from victim to survivor, from survivor to advocate. Lily was there, now 11, and already showing interest in following in my footsteps in medicine. My parents, who had been released from prison after fully cooperating with the investigations, sent a letter asking for forgiveness and expressing pride in the woman I had become, even if they couldn't claim credit for it. "A year ago, I was a scared girl who had been sold by her own family," I said in a small speech I gave that night. "Today, I am a young adult who has chosen to transform that experience into strength to help others. None of us can control what happens to us, but we can all choose what we do with what happens to us." In that moment, looking at the people who had become my chosen family, I understood that I had learned the most important lesson of all, that home is not where we are born, but where we choose to build our lives. That family is not just blood, but connections forged through choice, respect, and mutual love. And that sometimes the most unlikely paths of on, those that begin with betrayal and deception, can lead us exactly where we need to be to become who we were meant to be. This is my story, not of a victim who was saved, but of a young woman who discovered she had the power to save herself and, in doing so, found a way to help save others. It is the story of how traditions can be honored without perpetuating injustices, of how true love can grow in the most unlikely soils, and of how the truest families are those we build with intention, choice, and the courage to break cycles that no longer serve us. "How many other girls like me are there?" I asked him one afternoon when he seemed particularly troubled after a meeting. "More than I imagined," he replied, his voice heavy with weight. "And fewer than we fear we will find if we keep investigating." He had discovered that Rashid didn't work alone. He was part of an organization that operated in several Latin American countries, always using the same strategy, promising education and opportunities to mask human transactions. It was then that he made me a proposal that would change everything. "Would you like to help me dismantle this network?" The question caught me completely off guard. "How could I help?" I asked. You know their tactics firsthand, he explained. You know how they convinced your family? What lies they told? What documents they forged? Your testimony could be crucial to identifying other victims and to building a legal case against them. The idea of transforming my traumatic experience into a weapon against those who did this to other girls filled me with a determination I didn't know I possessed. But that means other people will know my story, I said, thinking about the exposure that would imply. Yes, he agreed. But it also means that other girls like you might not have to go through what you went through.
We decided that I would stay for a longer period, not as his fiancée,
but as his protected and collaborator in this mission. He arranged for me to have private lessons in Arabic, advanced English, and even some basic medical subjects, finally fulfilling the promise of education that had brought me here, although in a completely different way than imagined. Layla became my local culture teacher, helping me understand the nuances that would allow me to navigate this world with more confidence. But the deepest changes were happening in the dynamic between Sheikh Youssef and me. The formal conversations of the first days had given way to long discussions about philosophy, justice, and how traditions could be honored without perpetuating injustices. I discovered that he had a brilliant and questioning mind, and he seemed fascinated by my external perspective on his culture. It wasn't Romesai was still a minor, and he absolutely respected that, but it was an intellectual and emotional connection that neither of us had anticipated. You make me question things I have accepted my whole life, he told me one night when we were in the garden, watching the stars. It's as if your presence here has lit a light in corners of my mind that have been dark for too long. I understood what he meant. My own worldview had expanded immensely. I learned that different cultures were not necessarily wrong cultures, that traditions could coexist with progress, that people could change when confronted with evidence that they were wrong. The weeks turned into months, and our investigation into the human trafficking network began to yield fruit. We managed to identify 3 other girls who had been brought in through similar schemes, 2 of whom agreed to collaborate with our testimony. One of them, Sophia, a 16-year-old from a small town in New Mexico, had been sold by drug-addicted parents who believed the promise that she would work as a nanny for a rich family. Another, Isabella, from Florida, had been promised a cultural exchange program, exactly like me. Working with these girls gave me a sense of purpose that I had lost when I discovered my family's betrayal. Every testimony collected, every piece of evidence documented, every lie exposed was a small victory against the system that had swallowed us. Sheikh Youssef provided for all of us to have access to therapy, legal help, and, most importantly, real choices about our futures. But our investigation did not go unnoticed. Rashid and his associates began to feel the pressure, and their reactions became increasingly desperate. They first tried to bribe Sheikh Youssef, offering to return all the money and replace the girls who were causing problems. When that failed, they resorted to threats, claiming that he was violating legitimate contracts and would face legal consequences for breaking commercial agreements. It was during this period of increasing tension that I received an unexpected call. Lily had managed to get access to her aunt's phone and called me directly, bypassing the scheduled times. "Ava," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something. Mom and Dad, they want to talk to you." My stomach clenched. Since the discovery of the truth, I had refused to speak to my parents, even when they asked through lawyers. "They said they have important information about the men who took you," Lily continued. "Things that could help in the investigation." The possibility of obtaining additional evidence against Rashid was tempting, but the idea of confronting my parents again terrified me. Sheikh Youssef, who was present during the call, gently took the phone. "Lily, this is Youssef. We will figure out how to do this safely for your sister, okay?" He arranged for the conversation to happen with lawyers present, both in the US and here, ensuring that any information provided by my parents was properly documented and that I was legally protected. The day of the video conference was one of the most difficult of my life. Seeing my parents on the screen, older and clearly tormented by what they had done, brought back all the pain and confusion of the first days. "Ava," my mom said, starting to cry before she could even form a complete sentence. "Forgive us, my daughter. Forgive us for everything." My dad was more controlled, but his eyes avoided the camera. We really believed you would be educated," he said. "Rashid showed us documents, pictures of schools. He said the marriage would only be if you agreed, after years of study." The explanations came in pieces, mixed with tears and pleas for forgiveness. They had been manipulated almost as much as I had, But the crucial difference was that they had made a desperate choice. But still a choice to trust strangers with their own daughter's future. Rashid said that if we didn't accept his proposal, he would take our house, that you two would end up on the street, my mom explained. He knew details about our debts that no one should have known. This information was crucial for our investigation. Rashid and his organization didn't just exploit desperate families, they researched them, identified specific vulnerabilities, and then created coercion scenarios that made it difficult to refuse their offers. It was a much more sophisticated and predatory system than we had initially imagined. After the call, I spent hours processing what I had heard. On one hand, understanding that my parents had also been victims of manipulation brought some relief.
On the other,
the fact that they had made a choice even under pressure to trade my future for financial stability still hurt deeply. Sheikh Yusuf found me crying in the garden and simply sat down next to me, offering silent presence until I was ready to talk. They are victims too, I finally said, but that doesn't erase what they did to me. He nodded. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, he said. It means choosing not to let the pain control your future decisions. His words echoed in me for days. I was beginning to understand that forgiving my parents would be more for me than for them. It would be a way to free myself from the weight of the anger I was carrying. The information provided by my parents, combined with our own investigative work, gave us enough material to build a solid case against Rashid's network. Sheikh Yusuf had contacted international authorities, human rights organizations, and even investigative journalists. The story was about to become public, and with it, our hope of saving other girls. But publicity also meant exposure, and I knew my life would never again be private in the same way. Are you sure you want to do this, Sheikh? Yusuf asked on the eve of the first interview with journalists. Once your story becomes public, there's no turning back. I looked at him, this man who had gone from potential captor to protector and, gradually, to something I still couldn't fully define. I'm sure, I replied. If my story can save other girls from going through what I went through, then it's worth it. He smiled a genuine smile that completely transformed his face. Amara would be proud of you, he said. It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife, as if she were still an active presence in his life, and I realized that, in some way, my presence here had helped him honor her memory in a way that simply doing what was traditionally expected could not. The interview aired on a Tuesday morning, and by the end of the day, our story had spread to dozens of countries. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from human rights organizations, other victims wanting to share their stories, and even from universities offering scholarships. The world, I discovered, was full of people willing to help when they knew help was needed, but the most important reaction came from Lily. She called me crying, but this time they were tears of pride. You are the bravest person I know, she said. And one day I'm going to be a doctor too, so I can help people like you helped these girls. In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. No matter what happened from then on, I had transformed my experience from victimhood into a force for change. In the weeks that followed the publication of our story, Rashid and several of his associates were arrested in coordinated operations in multiple countries. Other girls were found and freed. Families were and a significant hole was opened in the human trafficking network that operated using education as a facade. It wasn't the end of the problem, it never would be, but it was an important beginning. Sheikh, Yusuf and I spent those weeks working with authorities, giving interviews, and coordinating with human rights organizations. Somewhere in the middle of all this activity, our relationship had evolved into something that neither of us could easily categorize. It wasn't. Romanikai was still a minor, and we both completely respected that, but it was deep, based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and a common vision of justice. What's going to happen to us now? I asked one night, when we finally had a moment of calm. We were on the terrace, watching the stars that had become a comforting constant in my new life. I don't know, he answered honestly, but I know that, no matter what happens, you will always have a place here, if you want. Not as my property, not as the result of a commercial agreement, but as ... family. The word family echoed between us, carrying weight and possibility. My original family had disintegrated through betrayal and despair. But maybe, just maybe, it was possible to build something new from the ruins. Not exactly what I had planned when I dreamed of being a doctor in a small house in West Virginia, but something that could be even more meaningful. It was on that night that I made my final decision. I would stay for another year, complete my preparatory studies, and then apply to medical schools both in the US and internationally. Sheikh Youssef had offered to finance my education, not as payment for services or as part of some agreement, but simply because he believed in my potential and wanted to see my dreams come true. There's one condition, I told him. I want Lily to come visit. I want her to see that it's possible to turn bad experiences into something positive. He smiled. That smile that had become so familiar and comforting. I was already planning to suggest that, he said. She seems to be as determined as you are. Maybe we can arrange for her to study here too, when she's older, if she wants. The possibility of having Lily close, of being able to take care of her the way I had always wanted, of giving her opportunities that our family never could have provided, was more than I had dared to hope for. It wasn't exactly the fairy tale ending, it was better. It was real, built on conscious choices and mutual respect instead of empty promises and questionable tradition. 2 months later, Lily arrived for her first visit. Seeing her get off the plane, taller and more mature, but still with the same radiant smile that lit up my days when we were little, was like watching my heart mend after months of fragmentation. Sheikh Youssef had arranged for her to stay for 2 weeks, long enough for her to get to know my new life and for me, to introduce her to the world of possibilities that now lay before us. Is it true you're going to be a doctor? She asked on the first night, as we explored the mansion that had gone from a prison to a home. It is, I replied. And you can too, if you want. We have resources now. We have opportunities we never had before. She hugged me tight, and in that hug I felt the weight of all the responsibility I had carried since childhood to protect her, to be an example for her, to ensure she had choices. During those 2 weeks, Lily met Layla, who immediately adopted her as a second granddaughter. She learned a few words in Arabic, tasted new foods, and spent long afternoons talking to Sheikh Youssef about medicine, about different cultures, about how people from completely different worlds could find common ground. Watching them interact, I knew I had found not just a new home, but a new family. On the last day of Lily's visit, we organized a special dinner in the garden. Layla had prepared traditional Middle Eastern dishes alongside some American foods she had learned to make, especially for us. Sheikh Youssef had invited a few close friends, people who had supported us during the difficult months, who had become part of our small, unlikely community.
If this story kept you hooked until now, just imagine the next ones. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any. Give this one a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from right now.
I want to make a toast, Sheikh Youssef said, raising his glass of pomegranate juice. 2 families we choose, 2 second chances, and 2 courageous young women who teach us that tradition without compassion is not tradition. It's just repetition. Everyone toasted. And in that moment, under the desert stars that had witnessed so much suffering and so much growth, I understood that I had found something I never knew I was looking for. It wasn't the end of the story, it was, in fact, just the beginning. Lily would return to the US to finish school, but would visit regularly. I would spend the next year studying intensively, preparing for university entrance exams. Sheikh Youssef would continue his work of reforming harmful traditions within his own community, using our experience as a catalyst for broader change. And one day, when I was older, when I had become the doctor I had always dreamed of being, maybe our relationship would evolve into something romantic, or maybe not. The beauty of the situation was that, for the first time in my life, I had time to discover who I really was, what I really wanted, without the pressure of desperate decisions or family expectations. As I watched Lily laugh with Layla, as I heard Sheikh Youssef tell stories about his childhood in the desert, as I felt the night breeze carry the scent of jasmine from the gardens, I knew I had learned the most important lesson of all, that family is not just blood, that home is not just the place where we are born, and that sometimes the most winding paths lead us exactly where we need to be. The scar of my parents' betrayal would always be with me, but it would no longer define my life. The fear and confusion of the first days in this distant country had transformed into gratitude and determination, and the man who should have been my captor had become my greatest ally in building a future that I myself would choose. This is my story, not of a victim who was saved, but of a young woman who discovered she had the power to transform her own destiny, even when that destiny began with the worst of betrayals. It is the story of how traditions can be honored without perpetuating injustices, of how true love sometimes grows in the most unlikely soils, and of how the truest families are those we build with intention and choice, instead of just circumstance and blood. And as the stars continue to shine over the desert, illuminating a future full of possibilities that I finally have the power to choose, I know that our story, mine, Sheikh Usuf's, Lily's, and all the girls we helped save is just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that honors the past without surrendering to it, that embraces traditions without becoming a prisoner of them. And that proves that sometimes the most unlikely endings are the truest of all.